Hi, welcome back to Caring Discourse. This time we are going to discuss communication in cancer care. As you will see, this episode is in continuity with the topic we discussed last time. We have more to say about metaphors today, and we will explore their use and functions talking about cancer care communication. We have two guest experts to discuss the importance of communication in this health context. Elena Semino from Lancaster University and Monick Leal from the Portuguese Cancer League, that in Portuguese it's called the Liga Portuguesa contra o Cancro. Today, we'll try to give you more space to interact with our guest experts. So if you want to ask something to them, please start your message with the hashtag question. This should help me to identify questions faster and to get back to you as soon as possible. So before introducing our guest, I have the great pleasure today to co-host this episode together with Sara Bigi. Hi, Sara.
Hello. Hi.
How are you?
To be here. Fine. It's great to be here again.
So thanks for joining me. Those who followed the last episode already know that Sara works at the Catholic University of Milan. She's a linguist and expert in medical argumentation. So Sara, I give to you the floor for the introduction of today's Caring Discourse episode.
Thank you, Maria Grazia. So in our first episode last time, we discussed the Reframe COVID movement, and we considered how it was a nice translation of linguists' competences to a more general audience. So today, we're going to discuss another example, an initiative of a different kind, of a linguist who has been able to translate the results of her research into, so to say, a usable product to improve people's well-being. Another reason why we particularly like these projects is that they are very nice examples of collaborative and interdisciplinary research that allows scholars to go out of their fields and contribute to the well-being, let's say, and to their communities. We think this is probably the way to go for research. And although we have great technical instruments and tools to do this, the challenges of interdisciplinarity and collaborative research are still there. And they probably will never go away. So we like to discuss these projects because they are good examples of successful projects in this respect. And we hope to be learning from them.
So thank you, Sara. Let's start by introducing our guest. Elena Semino is the director of the Center for Corpus Approaches to Social Science, based at the Lancaster University. She is also a professor of linguistics and verbal art at the same university. Elena is an applied linguist who combines qualitative and quantitative methods to study communication on sensitive and urgent topics, including cancer, mental illness, and climate change. Her research has had an impact on communication practices in healthcare settings, as we'll see today by discussing the metaphor menu for people living with cancer.
Our other guest is Monick Leal. She is a psychologist and head of the volunteer department of the Portuguese Cancer League, which is a private, non-profit, non-governmental organization founded in 1941 with branches across Portugal. This league provides support to cancer patients and their families, promoting health education and cancer prevention campaigns. Monick is also vice chair of the Patient Support Working Group within the Association of European Cancer Leagues that has also published a patient guide with tips and questions to doctors that can help patients to communicate effectively with healthcare professionals. So I guess at this point, we just have to invite our guests in, Maria Grazia.
Yes, all right. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you too. So let's start this conversation. Elena, last time Ines and Paula mentioned the metaphor menu for people living with cancer as having, let's say, an inspirational role for the hashtag Reframe COVID movement that is promoting novel frames to speak and to reason about the current pandemic. So we got curious about the metaphor menu in these past weeks. So why don't you tell us more about it? Why did you create a collection of metaphors for people living with cancer?
Okay, I'd be very happy to do that. So the metaphor menu for people living with cancer, and we'll show it in various ways, but this is one of its manifestations, is a collection of different metaphors produced by people living with cancer for different aspects of the experience of living with cancer. And how it came about, it came out of a project that we carried out at Lancaster University, looking at the metaphors used for the experience of cancer and also the end of life by people with advanced cancer, family carers, people who look after someone with cancer, and healthcare professionals. So the initial goal of our study was basically descriptive. It was to find out what metaphors are used, both in terms of types and frequencies, and then their implications for how that experience is framed, because we know that metaphors can have a framing effect. They can both reflect and influence how we think about things, how we experience things. But as part of the project, we were also many times asked, especially by people from the non-academic community, how we could produce a tool, a resource, something that would be useful for people with cancer and people who communicate with people with cancer professionally or otherwise, that would be based on the research. And the metaphor menu was that. The answer to those questions that people were asking us is a collection of different metaphorical framings to allow for different ways of talking about and seeing that experience.
So Elena, I'll be very direct and provocative. People could ask, why do we need a linguist after all to do this kind of job?
That's a very good question. I am not actually so territorial about my discipline, and maybe it didn't need a linguist, but I'll try to rise to the challenge of explaining why a linguist or a group of linguists, this work can't be done by oneself. So when we started the research, metaphors for cancer were already the topic of debate. Susan Sontag, very famously in 1979, 1980, wrote Illness as Metaphor. She was already taking issue with the military metaphors for cancer, which she argued were dominant and indeed are still dominant, certainly in countries such as the UK, the US, etc. So there was already a lot of discussion at the time. What we as linguists could do was, first of all, collect a lot of data and analyze it so that we could answer the question, what metaphors do people use? And look at how those metaphors were used in context to see how they frame the experience. By looking at metaphors in context, we could even see how people were feeling emotionally as a consequence of the metaphors that they were using. So as linguists, and we are discourse analysts who use corpus linguistic methods, we were able to find evidence of metaphorical patterns. I'm not saying that these studies hadn't been done before, but our study, we analyzed a corpus of 1.5 million words. So no study had been quite on that scale before. So we had a kind of solid descriptive account of what metaphors were used. We also had our type of evidence for how those metaphors might contribute to people's actual experiences. And what we saw was that, first of all, people use battle metaphors quite often, journey metaphors quite often, but they use a variety of metaphors as well alongside those. And also, we could also see that there is individual variation in terms of what metaphors people find useful or meaningful. So we both had evidence of large-scale patterns, but we also had evidence that, at least on the basis of our data, no metaphor seemed to be bad for everyone, and no metaphor seemed to be good for everyone. So, and this was consistent with what people had found in other areas, that when something is complex, sensitive, important, one metaphor is never enough. You need different metaphors as different angles on the experience. So as linguists, we had that evidence, both of patterns and of individual variation. And so we were in a good position to produce a collection of alternative metaphors, which is what the metaphor menu is, based on what people actually say. So all of the metaphor menu is a collection of quotes, and all the quotes reflect what somebody actually said about their experiences in a spontaneous context, not in a context where they were asked for a metaphor or asked about how they would conceptualize things, but as they were communicating online or in other contexts. So in that sense, as linguists, we had a reasonably privileged position to come up with that collection, but maybe we can talk about it in a moment, that the finished product, insofar as it's finished, involved oncologists, it involved cancer patients, involved charities, a local hospice. So many people were involved. Linguists can't do this by themselves.
Thank you, Elena. And this is exactly the point, I think, a very important one, where actually you very clearly explained how a linguist can provide evidence-based indication recommendations for the professionals, because a spontaneous understanding of metaphors could lead us to think that there is only one kind of metaphor that is always good for everything, right? And so this gives me the opportunity to turn to Monique and to ask her about this Portuguese Cancer League, which I know is spread all over Portugal and the islands. And so as a first question, I'd like to ask you, what are the main objectives of this organization, and which are the main activities that are relevant from a communicative point of view that you develop?
Okay, Sarah. I'm not only the coordinator of the volunteer department, so I have all the coordination of all patient support departments in Portuguese Cancer League in the north. So I'm in Porto, and as you said, there are other 5 regions who have this our support. So in Porto, I coordinate everything that has to be with the patient support and oncology units. So we have the volunteer department, we have the social support department, and we have a day center, and we have the psycho-oncology units in all over the north of Portugal. So we are situated to be more near to the patients in the other regions. So what we have done, we support the patients in all their phases of the illness and their families, not also the patients, but their family as well, because they are integral part of the treatment and recovery of our patients. So what we have seen with the communication is that cancer patients is very important to know how to communicate with them. Not only the healthcare professionals, but also the family and caregivers, because how we communicate is very important to the patients to go right with their disease and the recovery, because they are very anxious and very scary because all of the diagnosis and all the treatments, that is very difficult to establish a good communication with them, because as Elena Semino says, it's very I can say something to a cancer patient, and it could be very good to them, and I can say the same thing to other cancer patients. It can be very bad. So we have to we try to teach as well the healthcare professionals how to communicate with them, but also our volunteers, because we have at the hospital in Porto and Lisbon 400 volunteers that they support emotionally these patients and their families. So they have to know how to talk very well with them, because they could do very bad to the patients instead of doing the emotional support that they have to.
Thank you, Monique. Maria Grazia, maybe you would like to add something to that?
Yeah, yes, it's interesting that both of you mentioned that there is not like the perfect metaphor, the perfect word to say. So it would be very interesting to know more about the different types of metaphors, Elena, you collected. Can you show us, show us some examples, yeah, about the metaphor that you collected in your project. Sorry, just a moment, Elena, because you are muted. Okay.
Yes, I can definitely do that. As I said, metaphors to do with battles and journeys were the most frequent, but there are many different variants of those metaphors. So even those are not single metaphors. So for example, if we take even the battle metaphor, it can be used in ways where the illness is not necessarily the enemy. So one person who is represented in our menu says, you have fought back, taken control of the things left to you, and forced yourself to get out of bed and keep going. So sometimes the battle is not a battle against illness, but it's a battle for normal life. So partly what I'm saying is even the metaphors that have been so criticized and are so conventional have many different variants, and the same applies to journeys. But because human beings are so creative and there are so many different possible resources, one of the metaphors in the menu is a musical metaphor. So this person says, cancer is part of me. The cure for cancer is accepting it. To heal is to convince the cancer cells to sing in tune with the rest of the body. So here you can see that there is no enemy. There's also no travel, but try, and this person says to heal, which isn't necessarily just recovering in a sort of straightforward sense, is to achieve musical harmony, metaphorical musical harmony. And this gives you an example. There are many of the variety of metaphors that people use. And we chose this one because it is, on the one hand, quite different from the more conventional ones, but it's also very relatable, because even you don't have to be an expert musician to understand this idea of singing in tune. So this is one. I could give you more examples if there is time, but this gives you a sense of the variety.
I think I have a question regarding the use that can be made of this metaphor menu. I mean, I suppose you've had the opportunity to propose it to professionals, and I was wondering about how they use it and if you had any feedback from them.
Yes. So first of all, I should say we've made it available. It's available online. And we have said it exists in physical form as a leaflet, as well as a pack of cards that we've used in events. So you can, and you can have physical. When I can go back to my office, which is not right now, I'm happy to post hard copy versions to anybody who might want to use it. So to go to your question. It has been included in a tool for a kind of toolkit for women with breast cancer that was developed at Imperial College in London. I have distributed it very widely, so it's being used in by especially patient support groups in locally in the UK, but also there's a place in South Africa where it's being used. A contact in Mexico is thinking about translating it into Spanish. And Cancer Research UK, which is one of the two biggest cancer-related charities in the United Kingdom, has added it to its list of resources for people with cancer, so that people can download it and make use of it, both healthcare professionals and people with cancer. I don't always know when people are using it, because the downside of making it available so widely is that you have no control over who and when they use it. And so sometimes I find out by chance that people have used it. But yes, I have some evidence that people are finding it useful. And I should also say it's not meant as a definitive list of metaphors. It's partly meant as a celebration of the variety of metaphors that people can use, but also as inspiration, because it's a bit like if you continue the cooking metaphor, you can make your own recipe when you see other people's dishes. So the idea is very much that it can be used as inspiration, and I know that some people have used it that way to open up a conversation, not just to close it to this particular list.
Monique, it would be nice to have your impression as a psychologist on the usefulness of the metaphor menu for people living with cancer.
Yeah, I think it's a great instrument to use, because they can teach the healthcares and persons how to use it, because sometimes they use some of them, they are not that the ones that they use that they have to say to the cancer patients. So because it's very difficult to people to talk about cancer, and if you can use another way to talk about it, not to be so drastic, and one thing that is very important, they don't know how to talk about it. So I think that this metaphor menu is very important, because we can have some instruments look at and say, you know, this metaphor is important for this, or you can talk about that issue with this meta or that metaphor. So yeah, it will be Ines also is now a question about how we train. For example, it could be a good instrument to train my volunteers to talk with the patients. Yeah, because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to talk about patients because they're all their state of mind, and because they are always they feel that they are everyone is not saying everything to them, you know. They think that the person that is talking about her is not talking everything, so it's very difficult because they need a clear and important language to them.
So, Elena, during the last month, anyone who wrote against the word metaphors referred to the American writer Susan Sontag. Many have implicitly or explicitly referred to her essay Illness as a Metaphor, published in 1971. And at the beginning of this essay, she wrote, "My subject is not physical illness itself, but the uses of illness as a figure or metaphor. My point is that illness is not a metaphor, and that the most truthful way of regarding illness and the healthiest way of being healed is one most purified of, most resistant to metaphorical thinking." Elena, would you like to comment on that?
Yes. I should say, obviously, Susan Sontag's work and thinking have been so influential, and in a way, maybe our project wouldn't even have existed without her critique of those metaphors and her challenge also, to some extent, to look deeper into this. So Susan Sontag criticized the relationship between illness and metaphor from two perspectives. On the one hand, she was critical of military metaphors for cancer and also for TB and then AIDS later on, because of their associations, because of the way in which the patient ends up being either a victim or the battlefield, and because of all the negative associations that go with that military war battle framing for the experience of illness. And on the other hand, she was also critical of the way in which the illnesses themselves are used as metaphors for bad things. So that, and a colleague and I have done work on this too, so that cancer is used as a metaphor for the negative things in society. So, you know, the cancer of corruption or problems metastasizing. And she was also, and her point was, and it's a very valid one, that basically for people who are already having a difficult experience, to see their own illness being used as the kind of epitome of badness is then can lead to more distress and more stigma. So she, I think rightly, criticized both directions in terms of the relationship between metaphor and illness. Where I think I would disagree, and many people have also sort of expressed some reservations, and she also later wrote slightly differently about that, is that it is desirable but even possible to completely eliminate metaphors from the discourse around illness. So first of all, I should say, in spite of my professional angle and personal angle on this, of course, it is absolutely fine if people don't use metaphors for their illness. So there's no, of course, the metaphor menu can also, you know, you don't need to use it. That is not an issue. However, first of all, human beings have a tendency to use metaphors generally. So metaphors are very hard to eliminate. Mostly we're not even aware that we're using them, or we're not even aware that we're exposed to them. So there is a tendency to use metaphors. It is very difficult to stop. Second, illness in particular is the kind of experience that it cannot always be captured just via literal language, because, and this is the upside of metaphor, the use of metaphor expands your ability to communicate, because you can talk about one thing in terms of another. So your ability to express your experiences, provide your perspective, is enhanced by using metaphors. So that, to my mind, it's not realistic to eliminate metaphors. It's also not in general, and it's also not necessarily desirable, because metaphors can be useful. Now, it is maybe possible to eliminate metaphors from certain particular contexts. So some people would say, if someone dies, don't give me the metaphors, they passed away or whatever, tell me, use the literal word. So I'm not saying that there are no contexts in which literal language cannot be privileged, but it's neither realistic nor particularly desirable. And so what we are saying is, given that metaphors can be both helpful and harmful, let's focus on making them helpful as possible. And that's the whole idea of our work. But of course, it is absolutely fine if people decide that as much as they can, they're using literal language, or they prefer to have literal language used with them.
So I guess I have a little question about this idea of stigma that you were mentioning. Sontag was very worried about this. And I'd like a comment from both of you, actually, from both your perspectives, from the linguist perspective and the psychologist. So where does the stigma come from? Is it in words, or is it somewhere else? I mean, how can you work around it?
Monick, do you want to go first? I'm happy either way.
Yeah, it's okay. You can be. It's not only words, because if you notice, in the past we don't say the word cancer. You know, it was something wrong, something bad. Here in Portugal, we say that they died for something bad, and not for cancer that does not exist. So I think the stigma comes from them, that, you know, because they don't really know what that was. So, and then people have, and still now, they have, they don't want that the other people know, because they have some misconception about what the people think about them, if they are healed, and so they are the little ones, I don't say how we say it in English, but that they are less than the others because they have the disease, you know. So I think, and that is an important part, because it's very difficult to talk with them, because they are always thinking that we are with pity of them. Pity was the word, pity of them. So and they don't want the neighbors to know that they have the disease. So I think it comes not only for the words itself, but also as the cultural thing at best.
Yeah, I think what I would also, I agree with everything Monick said, and also cancer has had and still has additional stigma because it's very hard to treat, and as we know, it's not one illness but many. It is the idea of uncontrollable growth in the body has something that is potentially can be perceived as alien or monstrous. So there is something about the nature of the illness, the way in which it manifests itself, that is both hidden and potentially visible. And this idea of growth inside the body, that I think has contributed to its stigma in many societies and over a long period of time. The fact that the treatments tend to have side effects that are sometimes more deforming of the body, with losing hair, etc., than the illness itself. So that it becomes a visible mark, which is what stigma is, that there is a particular look associated with chemotherapy. I know that things obviously are improving in that area too, but traditionally that has been the case. all of this contributes to stigma. Plus, in addition, the fact that, and this applies to other illnesses too, but the fact that the association with lifestyle factors, which is always a bit of a double-edged sword, the fact that, oh, you have lung cancer, or it must be because you smoked, or you have this cancer, it must be because you didn't look after yourself, and then, or you're getting worse, or maybe you should be more positive, try to be more positive. So the sense of personal blame that is also, can also be associated with it, that somehow you brought it upon yourself. All of these things together contribute to stigma and self-stigma. Like Monique was saying, people traditionally don't want others to know. And certainly when I was growing up in Italy, and I had an experience with my father dying of cancer, which actually is behind a lot of the work that I do. It wasn't talked about. People were not being told they had cancer. And so that led to a kind of situation of secrecy in a situation that was already deeply distressing, that makes everybody's life harder. So things are much better in terms of the reduction in stigma, but it varies also from cancer to cancer. So for some cancers, like lung cancer, for example, there is still quite a lot of stigma.
So we have already questions in the chat. So let's start with this one.
Yeah. So yeah, go on. So how did we go about collecting our data? Basically, again, we were in a group. So I have a number of colleagues, both linguists and non-linguists. We decided we wanted to have language use from, obviously, people with cancer themselves, people who look after someone with cancer, and healthcare professionals. So we had these three groups. And obviously, you can have data of different kinds. We decided to have interviews for the first two groups, people with cancer and family carers. One of our collaborators, who is from cancer care and palliative care, already had interviews that we could use at the time when we were doing the project. So we then did interviews with healthcare professionals who work in hospices and deal with patients with cancer at the end of their lives. And then, because of the way in which illness is one of many topics that people write autobiographically online, and sometimes in very personal ways, we decided to look at online forum data. So we have online forum posts and interviews with each of the three groups. The interviews, well, as you can imagine, were conducted in relatively straightforward ways. With online forum data, we looked at potential different sources, and then there's a process of selection, download, in some cases sampling. It's all published, so I'm not going to go into the technical details here, and also contacting forum owners, etc., to make sure that there were no objections, and anonymization, etc. But these are the main sources, our sources of data. So the differences, the question in the choice of metaphors used for physical versus mental illnesses. Well, my research is not quite broad enough to answer this question in a definitive way. However, there are some similarities. So the idea of illness as an opponent to be fought actually really spans pretty much any illness. So you can fight your depression, you can fight anorexia, etc. So there are some metaphors that are so ingrained, at least in some languages, that they apply to both physical and mental illnesses, and battle metaphors, and also to some extent journey metaphors apply to both. But there are also some differences. So with mental illnesses, at least in English, there are very conventional metaphors to do with, for example, up and down opposition. So positive emotional states being up and negative emotional states being down. This is something that really is primarily to do with, is applied much more to mental illness than physical. And the association with darkness, for example, darkness tends to go with emotional experiences rather than physical ones. And so that's another example of a metaphor that applies more to mental illness than physical illness. But it's very difficult to generalize. There are some similarities and some differences, I would say. And the ones I've mentioned are examples of those.
So I see that we have other questions already, but before I'd like to ask another question to Monique, because as we said earlier, you are also vice chair of the patient support working group within the Association of European Cancer Leagues. So could you tell us more about the rationale behind the guide on how to prepare for a medical consultation?
Cancer Leagues is an association that have all the cancer, national cancer with all European countries. So we've met twice a year, and we in patient support working group, we try to see how we can, as European countries, we can get together and work to the cancer patient care. So we have done this guide because we all have this problem in all countries, in European countries, how people, how difficult it is to communicate with healthcare professionals. So we come together and we establish this guide to help patients how to communicate effectively with their healthcares, because we've seen that because of all the stress and when the patients get to the consultations, and because they are very small in time with the healthcares, they don't ask to patients, to the healthcare, to the doctor, everything that they want to. So we put, you can show Maria if you want to, the guide. We can put a leaflet to help patients what they have as a relative partner, to go with to the appointments with them, to make a list of the questions that they would like to answer, and we have some, we put all together, and we help the patients how to communicate with the healthcares. So we put this one, and then we are going to take another one to help healthcare to communicate with the patients, the opposite.
Thank you, Monique. And I go back to the other question. So this is for you, Elena.
Yeah, so the question is whether our data suggests certain metaphors are more or less prevalent at different stages of the illness, soon after diagnosis, during treatment, etc. So we can't answer this question. It's a great question, and we often get asked, actually. So our because of the way we collected our data, we were not able to study that any development or any correlation between the use of metaphor and the stage of the illness in any systematic way. What I would say is that even without trying, I refrain from using any prescriptive approach, but it is definitely the case that some metaphors are more appropriate at some stages of the illness than others. And actually the metaphor menu itself has some metaphors that might be more appropriate that capture the period just after diagnosis. There are some metaphors that are about living after cancer treatment, when you're no longer in active treatment, but you're still there's still the possibility of recurrence. So different metaphors may be appropriate or may be best at capturing different experiences. And the importance of having a variety of metaphors available is partly because if, say, for example, the fighting metaphor might be helpful when somebody has still the opportunity of curative treatment, but the treatment might be very difficult and very unpleasant. So for some people, the idea that they're fighting with a good chance of winning might really be motivating at that stage of the illness. But if that's the only metaphor, the main metaphor that people have, and the treatment doesn't work, then you end up with the most harmful development of that metaphor, which is that you're losing the battle. Whereas if you have a number of metaphors, if you have the idea of a journey, if you have the idea of some kind of team experience that you might have with your family or with other patients. If you have the idea of musical harmony, which can be a matter of, you can lose it, you can regain it, etc. If you have a range of metaphors at your disposal, as well as an awareness that sometimes you might want to dispense with metaphors altogether, then you're less likely to end up being almost potentially metaphorically trapped with a metaphor that at a later stage really becomes harmful. So, but it would be really useful to do studies that look at the development of metaphors or metaphors at different stages. But our study couldn't look at that specifically.
This is a long one.
Right, Lisa, yes. And actually, I mean, without going into a question from Lisa many years ago also helped in the production of the metaphor menu, but she may not remember. Right, so 2 questions. In my experience, how easy is it for people to spontaneously come up with alternative creative metaphors? Does this process typically need to be facilitated in some way? So we, in a sense, we didn't elicit the metaphors. So I can't really answer this first question very well. There was a paradoxical experience that I had a couple of times, precisely when we were having meetings with people with cancer or volunteers, etc. And every now and again, somebody would say, a bit like Sontag, I hate metaphors. I want people to tell it like it is. I don't like metaphors. I don't use metaphors. For me, my cancer is, and then they would produce a metaphor. And at that point, I had to really hold back because it would be so rude to say, hold on, you've just used one. But so people are not necessarily aware of it, but when they're trying to articulate, for me, my cancer is actually, it's very difficult to just remain exclusively with literal language. We've had sessions where the presence of the menu helps people come up with different metaphors, because they might come up with variants of those metaphors that say why they don't like one metaphor, they might come up with another. But I don't have an enormous amount of experience of metaphor elicitation. It is part of what we do when we run events, but it's not the only thing we do, and I'm not actually trained to do that either. The second question, I think, is also important. So if metaphors are so dependent on each individual's unique life experiences, doesn't that make communication more difficult? Isn't there something to be said for the type of metaphor that is likely to be meaningful to almost everyone, such as journeys? This was really something that we really had to spend a lot of time thinking about when we were putting the metaphor menu together. And that was, given that in our data and even anecdotal observation will confirm that, battle type metaphors and journey type metaphors are the most frequent, and they are by far the most frequent in our data. Do we include them in the menu? And in particular, do we include battle metaphors in the menu, given that in part this is about alternatives? So in the end, we did include them, but we tried to include especially battle metaphors that are not disempowering in our terms, where they are motivating rather than otherwise. So precisely because they're so common, we didn't think that we could just exclude them. And the same basically applies to journeys, so we included them. But at the same time, we try to, in terms of alternatives, we try to include, in some cases, metaphors that were quite unique. The musical one is fairly unique. But we thought, and when I say we had sessions with, as say, different members of the community, with charities. So there was a lot of discussion that went into picking the metaphors. The metaphors that might be unique, but it might be, we thought might be relatable because, for example, the idea of singing in tune is something that is a shared experience. It's not a kind of technical thing. But in some cases, even if the metaphors appear to be very individual, we knew that there was a pattern in our data that went in that direction. So we have a metaphor of cancer as an unwelcome lodger, where the metaphor is very specific, but the idea of some kind of uninvited guest was actually present in our data. So the metaphors we have often reflect a more minor pattern rather than a general one. But we also excluded, so there were some that were so individual and they were very powerful, but we found that they were so individual to the person that we could not really use them. And at the end of the day, it's kind of a judgment as to where that applies that can only be made by consulting with different people.
And we have another question by Olga Blanco. Elena said you can get an idea of people's feeling by their use of metaphors. Could they be using conventional and treated metaphorical language? How do you assess their feelings?
Yeah, so obviously you can't always, and in fact it varies depending on the context in which they use the metaphors. So one point that you make is really important. So people use the language, we all use the language that is around us and that we're used to hearing. And so some of the more conventional metaphors about the cancer journey or fighting the disease, etc., people use them because that's the conventional language that is used. And in some ways, in that sense, and you can't always tell from textual evidence how that metaphor is making the person feel. In that sense, the menu, in part, has the goal of raising awareness that these are metaphors, and as such, that each metaphor is just one option. This is the really important thing for me. The metaphor menu is not meant for people who can already criticize the metaphors around them, because we are linguists, but most people, especially in a very stressful situation, are not in the best position to actually say, hey, hold on a minute, that's a metaphorical framing I disagree with. So it's a way of raising awareness. But sometimes we can find textual evidence for how a metaphor is making somebody feel. And one example that I often use is somebody who, writing on an online forum, says that their cancer has spread. And then she says, I feel such a failure that I'm not winning this battle. So the word failure, she describes herself as feeling that way about herself. So we've got an explicit negative evaluation of herself, immediately followed by not winning the battle. And this is where we can then see, why should someone feel a failure in that context? You can be angry, you can be distressed, but the failure is, if anything has failed, it's the treatment. But the failure then can be explained in terms of that framing of not winning. So sometimes it's possible. And then, of course, there are experiments. And we also did an experiment where we gave people a story about the same person, one with a battle metaphor, one with a journey metaphor. And we asked people to say, well, if this person doesn't get better, to what extent do you think they'll feel guilty? And the people who read the battle version of the text attributed more feelings of guilt to this imaginary person with cancer than the people who read the journey version. So there are different kinds of evidence, but it's not always possible. It's not always possible, that's for sure.
That's really interesting. And speaking of, oh, sorry, Monique, did you want to say something?
Yeah, because that example that Elena said is very important, because that phrase that winning the disease have such more implications how the patients feel if the disease returns, you know,
yeah.
Because they don't feel that. Yeah, it's very important.
I was going to say, before other questions come up, speaking of awareness, Maria Grazia, I think you have something, a project to launch, or a call, maybe better to say.
One of the reasons why we are here today talking about the metaphor menu, it's because we have an important collaborative proposal we want to launch today here in Portugal. And so to launch this proposal, listen to the message recorded by Irene Carvalho, that is professor of the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Porto and also president of the Portuguese Association of Healthcare Communication, that in Portuguese it's called the Sociedade Portuguesa de Comunicação Clínica em Cuidados de Saúde. So the video.
Hello. Metaphors are used in clinical practice, and they can actually serve different functions. For example, professionals use metaphors to help them translate technical terms and technical concepts into a language that patients actually understand. but metaphors can also be useful in sensitive situations to approach difficult or sensitive topics more easily. So metaphors are useful tools in conveying information in clinical practice and in health contexts. And wouldn't it be great to have a menu of metaphors readily accessible for professionals to use? Such initiatives already exist in other countries, such as the UK, with works like, for example, Elena Semino's, who created a metaphor menu for cancer that can be used. And this is why we are launching this initiative here in Portugal as well, to create a metaphor menu or a menu of metaphors that are culturally relevant in our country, to be used in clinical practice and in health contexts. So please do contribute to this menu. Thank you.
So, if you are living with cancer, if you are a caregiver, or if you are a healthcare professional, suggest your own metaphor. It would be interesting to know more about the peculiar metaphors we use here in Portugal. So, I'll post the links in the chat in a moment, and I will make them available also on the website of the Metacare project that promotes this initiative together with Irene Carvalho, the Liga Portuguesa contro Cancro, Sara Bigi, and of course Elena Semino. We'll make the questionnaires also available also in Italian and English, and we will share the metaphors we receive with Elena, of course. Elena, I know you also would like to encourage people to use the metaphor menu, so would you like to add something on that?
Yes, and I should say this is all collaborative. So none of these initiatives are not in competition with each other. That is not the point. Yes, the metaphor menu. I think the link is available. Is available as a web page. You can download the PDF. On the web page where you can find the menu, there's also a questionnaire where you can give us feedback, and we've had quite a lot of feedback. It's very, very useful. And also there's a box where people can propose their own metaphors, but I strongly encourage people to go to the page that Maria Grazia has talked about as well. As I say, this is all a collaboration. If anybody is interested in the menu, and as I say, anybody can use it. If you do use it, or if you do find it useful, it would be great if you could let me know. It's very helpful to me to know how people are using it, and as I've said before, I don't always find out. But yeah, it's meant as inspiration, as a tool for inspiration and for creative uses. So the more there are, the better.
So thank you, Elena. Let's see.
I think there was just one short question before we wrap up from Olga, but yeah, I think it's for Elena again.
So the question is, apart from frequency, have you conducted any analysis of metaphorical elaboration? Yes. So the work that we have done has been, frequency is often the starting point, just to have a sense of the kinds of metaphors that people use. But actually, then we've done qualitative studies of how people use different kinds of metaphors, how different variants of, for example, battle metaphors, different variants of journey metaphors, but we've looked at more specific things like, for example, how people use metaphors to talk about communication between patients and healthcare professionals, how healthcare professionals talk about their own emotional experiences when dealing with very serious illness and also death. We've also looked at, and this is maybe a positive thing to end on, that one of the things we discovered in looking at our online data was that how much humor there was on the Cancer Forum, and especially humorous uses of metaphors to diffuse very difficult topics, to deal with taboo, but also to, in a sense, empower oneself. If you can laugh at something, it doesn't, at least for that moment, have that amount of control on you that otherwise makes it difficult to deal with, and also to create a sense of community. So some elaborations that we looked at were humorous, and we've written about that too, the function of humor, including metaphorical humor in communication about cancer. All our articles are, if you go to my university page, all our articles are available to download open access. We also have a book, and that is not available open access, but if you can't get it from your library, email me.
So thank you, Elena, and thank you, Monique. I hope this call for metaphors will be the first of many initiatives we do together. Sarah, I don't know if you have something else to.
No. That was, I think, yeah, we've said just about everything.
Yeah. So perhaps I could say something about the next Caring Discourse episode that will be special in some way, because on June 15th we lost in this space our annual conference, which normally held in Lisbon, where I work. This year, as you can imagine, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, will go virtual. So this year we'll discuss the concept of shared decision making. The conference title is Conceptual, Ethical and Practical Challenges to the Shared Decision Making Paradigm. And so this year we have two guest speakers, Paul Gulbrandsen from the Institute of Clinical Medicine of the University of Oslo, and Srikant Sarangi from the Danish Institute of Humanities and Medicine of the Aalborg University. The format will be innovative. We'll record all the talks in advance and we'll make them available 1 week before the conference on the Caring Discourse YouTube channel. So you will have a week or even more to listen to them and to get prepared for the discussion that will be broadcasted live on June 15. So please, if after listening to our speakers, you would like to ask a question, write to me and I'll let you know how to do it live on June 15th. And of course, follow us on our social media accounts to stay updated on the conference program and the others Caring Discourse initiative. So if there are no other questions, I think
No.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we can close this episode.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank our guests very much.
Thank you, and thank
you
everyone
for the invitation.
Yeah, and thank you to all who participated in the chat with comments and questions. And many thanks. So ciao, and we'll see you on June 15th.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.